Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I want to jump really right into the topic at hand. A little bit of background on Innovyze, just a background on myself, so you know the angle at which I'm coming on this topic. So Innovyze is about water, all sorts of water, clean water, wastewater, floodwater, stormwater, a range of software solutions. But I personally have spent the last 22 years really in flood modeling, flood prediction, flood science. That's what I was trained in engineering school to do. And I guess I'm maybe one of the few people that actually I'm doing what I went to school to do. Now I'm not a practicing engineer, but creating the engineering software and the solutions to do flood modeling and prediction is what I've done my entire career. So while Innovyze covers a broad range, I really have a keen interest in flooding. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story, but before we get to that, the title of this conference was, the end of the world as we know it. So I thought it might be worthwhile to do just a basic rundown of what do we know. What are we saying? It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of flood modeling, flood forecasting, flood mapping. What have we been doing? What do we know right now? Or we think we know? We need to consider our frame of reference. If we're going to get to a solution, we need to consider our assumptions on where we are. So most of what we know about flood modeling is based in the development of flood forecasting technology and data development done in the 1970s, right? Kind of the emergence of computing power, or even the emergence of robust data collection systems. So the idea that we could actually take weather data, rainfall, storm surge data, feed it into algorithms or feed it into some sort of predictive model. This was fantastic development in the 70s. The approaches were codified and legislated really throughout the developed world. So today, we're basically following those same practices. The basic idea was, let's extract statistical probability distributions from weather data, to simplify, right? Because it's a lot of data. If you keep track of the rain and everything every single day, it's just too much data to digest. So let's extract the key points. And so that's just statistical analysis on measured data. Then somebody somewhere made a decision about, okay, so what's the important data point? What's our appetite for risk when it comes to flood modeling and mapping? And I can't be sure exactly how this went, but I imagine it was something like this. How often do you want to be flooded? Well, I don't want to be flooded ever. Okay, well, I probably can't avoid that. How about maybe, every year, are you okay with a 1% chance of being flooded? I'm not sure what a 1% chance of being flooded is. I'm not sure what that means. Well, what it kind of means is that if there was a 1% chance every year, you'd have to go 100 years before you're flooded. Okay, now people started grasping that. And so we get to the concept of a 100-year storm or a 100-year event. That's something that the public can grasp as an assessment of their risk. There's a few problems with that, right? It's the probability of being flooded this year really has no relevance on the probability next year, so it's not going to be 100 years between these events. But again, that's a bit of a mentality that's set in because of assumptions and explanations made a while ago. Okay, well, let's say that the 100-year event's okay. We kind of feel good about that. I'm going to be dead in 100 years, no problem, right? That seems like an acceptable risk level. Okay, well, let's plug that data point in rainfall then into our algorithms, and let's map the flooding. Now, since the computational power in the 70s was somewhat limited, we simplified as much as we possibly could. We said, well, what's the Earth's surface look like? Let's take a couple data points. We can't handle many. We've got that one data point about rainfall. We've got a couple data points about the surface, and we can handle that. Or I can do that manually, or with your 64 kilobyte processor, you could run that for it was about 20 to 30 minutes and get an answer about how deep is the flood going to be right there, given that rainfall. Okay. The third step was, okay, let's extrapolate those few data points everywhere and make a map. Okay, now we know where it's going to flood when we have a 100-year event. That was the mentality. We spent a lot of time on items 2 and 3 I just mentioned, which was tweaking the algorithms and tweaking the extrapolation to make maps. It's cool. It's pretty fun stuff if you're kind of a data scientist or you're a software developer. It's exciting to apply physical hydraulic science into code. Why? Because it's quantifiable. We have a pretty good handle on the physics of hydraulics. Unfortunately, we just kind of avoided the whole initial input, which was the weather data, the rainfall data. Why? Because it's hard to predict. We can't codify that to an answer as easily as the depth calculation and the mapping calculations. So we spent a lot of time assuming an input and then just fine-tuning all of the outputs from that. So we end up today with the prospect of, we've got a few pictures of flooding up here saying, well, we feel pretty good about our ability to predict that flooding, the technology, but we're now confronted with the input to our technology. We actually maybe need to revisit that, because it doesn't matter how good the algorithm is to produce the answer if the input's not very good. So, a little bit of story to illustrate this example and what's happened in the last several years as awareness around extreme events have risen. There's been a variety of responses to this flood mapping idea. So this was in the New York Times, actually just a few months ago, referencing the redrawing of flood maps for New York City. The title of the article was by David Chen. Title of the article, you can read there in New York, "Drawing Flood Maps is a Game of Inches." So immediately you see the assumption that actually we can predict flood within inches. Because look, we've built all this technology, we know this stuff. We've been doing it for years. So I can tell you within an inch or two. I might say that we're fooling ourselves with that kind of assumption. So what happened with the New York flood map? What did we know? The 100-year floodplain, which again we can debate the accuracy of that term, but in 2008 this was the 100-year floodplain mapped by FEMA for for a neighborhood right by Jamaica Bay. We figured, before Hurricane Sandy, the assumption was, yeah, there's going to be some flooding. We're pretty safe. The other assumption was, you're kind of in or out. So we can draw a line, and if you're in the line, you're going to be flooded, and if you're out, you're not. So then insurance is available, those in and out. It's difficult. There's essentially this idea of single truth to flood mapping. Here's the single truth. We will build our insurance, we will build our infrastructure, we will build our risk mitigation strategies around this single truth, which is the 100-year flood map. Okay, so what happened with Sandy? All right. What actually happened is there on my left side, and was that a single event? Well, this was the most severe, but if you recall, through 2010 to 12, we had Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, and then Hurricane Sandy, all of which did not result in the 100-year floodplain as we knew it. Again, this is the worst extent, but all right, so we made some mistakes. What do we do about it? What was the response to this? FEMA, who in the United States is basically charged with making sure the flood maps are okay and providing insurance or mitigation money, they actually got onto this pretty quickly. And in many ways, New York, the New York City approach, or the FEMA-sponsored approach in New York City, was just what we're talking about today, which is they said, we need to remap this, and we need to account for higher variability in the weather, the storm surge, the rainfall. Look, at the time, I was thinking, man, that is fantastic. So what happened next? They made a great effort. Now, they're still kind of operating under some erroneous assumptions, which is that single source of truth idea. There is one floodplain map, and if we get it right, we will, it'll be right. All right, well, again, that's just not true with natural weather events. And they did use some updated technology, but still not even the latest science that was available. Why not? Well, because they weren't familiar with how that worked. Legislation, regulations said, do it this way. Again, based on the 1970s available technology, do it this way and you'll get the right answer. So look, there was a pretty good effort all in all. And so, look, FEMA said, here's our recommendation. New York City said, absolutely not. This is what we want on the far side for me. Said, FEMA, you're out of your mind. We cannot put all those people in a flood zone. And more importantly, those people can't afford to pay flood insurance, which you will mandate when you draw that flood zone around them. So, it's just not fair. It's not economically viable. We've got to reduce that floodplain so that, So we can pretend like we're not going to have to spend money on this problem, I guess. And so let's ignore some of that extreme weather data and say those really were outliers. Yeah, there's going to be more flooding, but not that much flooding. All right, so now we've lost the plot in terms of actual scientific technology application of some knowledge that we have. This is not a unique situation, right? This is repeated over and over many places around the world where we actually continue to try to know what we used to know and justify it with economic or political justifications and ignore the basic concepts. So what I might suggest is that as we deal with climate variability, climate change, is that it's trauma-inducing. Flood, in particular, is very trauma-inducing. And as we are all people, right? FEMA is made up of people. Organizations are made up of people. We have a fairly well-documented response to trauma. The stages of grief by the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, denial. That was a one-off. No one could have known that Sandy would be so bad. That's not going to happen again. Flat out denial of, there's actually a quote from a woman in this article who said, I don't want to live in a high-risk flood zone, but I don't want to move. So, okay, so that's just flat out denial, right? And look, we can go on and on about denial, but that's the first thing we do is say it's not real. The second thing is we're angry. We said, whose fault is this? Hurricane Sandy wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had that industrial revolution. So it's somebody's fault, and I'm angry about it. And there's lots of finger pointing. Who's causing this? And again, in the back of the mind is we can stop this and make it the way it was. And then we go right to bargaining about how do we make it the way it was. We, in this case, it's almost comical in that we're bargaining with FEMA to control flooding. They have nothing to do with controlling flooding. They have no ability to control flooding. But they're kind of the visible target to bargain with. So currently, right now, this is not resolved, and the city of New York is bargaining with FEMA about where are the flood lines? Again, how are they bargaining? Well, based on economic, political arguments, and kind of throwing out the data and the things that we now know. So, bargaining, we'll do our part. Right? So this is a little bit of the Paris Treaty, right? We'll do our part, you do your part. Maybe we can help mitigate this situation overall. Is it too late? Well, probably. We're not going to reverse everything, next year. And there's a good chance we'll get flooded somewhere next year in an extreme way. I'm not going to go into depression and acceptance, other than saying to get to acceptance, it means that we stop denying, we stop arguing about why, and we stop bargaining with non-controlling entities, and we get on with updating our approach and our acceptance of, our response needs to change along with the climate change that's happening. We got to accept that our methods and that our plans need to be dynamic, not static, single source of truth type answers. And we can't pretend that new data will not emerge over time. So, business and democracy. What are likely consequences and proposals I would put forward? Consequences to businesses are somewhat obvious, right? You've got repetitive property loss. You've got faulty business continuity planning. So even if you didn't lose your plant or your business, you've lost productivity, your people can't get to work, right? You just missed something in your business continuity planning, which leads to productivity loss, ultimately potentially job loss. And particularly for heavy industries, there's environmental damage risk that comes up as flooding in heavy industry typically does not turn out all that well for contamination and pollution. So those changes or those consequences are obvious. What are the proposals to do? What do we do about it? Well, as is happening in New York, there are a few businesses who are saying, hey, for my business, I can do my own flood risk assessment. Right? You don't have to rely on FEMA. You can hire any number of consulting engineers. You can hire any number of experts to do a site assessment and give you a more accurate depiction of your business. Now, sure, it costs some money. Probably costs less money than losing it in a flood, but it costs some money. You can undertake actually flood response planning. So another thing that happens with businesses is they might know if they're in or out of a flood zone and they fail to say, okay, what are we going to do? What is that continuity plan for flood? We often do it for power outages, we do it for all sorts of things, and for flood we miss it. The other thing business can do is apply that pressure to local regulators to deal with reality. Right? Homeowners have a voice, and we have strong voices because it's our home. But businesses have as much or sometimes more of a voice with local municipalities and those that are regulating and controlling. How are we doing our flood mapping? What are we addressing? And finally, stop playing the game of inches, right? That title is the game of inches. Your business is not going to be this far out of the floodplain forever and ever. It might, there's an approach that needs to be taken where your margin of error is not inches when it comes to climate variability. What about democratic government? What are the implications here? Now, put very honestly, repetitive episodes of the suspension of the rule of law. All right, we see it. When there's severe flooding, you get differing levels, but there's typically a breakdown of societal norms and the rule of law. That's not good, because a democracy is hinging upon the rule of law and the consent by all those to be governed. Right, we start the government agencies experience a loss of confidence and a loss of consent to be governed. Because it's perceived as incompetence or indifference to the damage that flood is causing to people. And ultimately, right, the consequences to democratic government is we have to explain, we have to justify privatizing gains and socializing losses. I didn't charge these people flood insurance because XYZ. But we all need to pay to help them out. Okay. There's goodwill. That people are somewhat willing to do that, but not over and over and over again. And there's the perception of, hold on, this is an unfair stance for government to take. So ideally, democratic institutions would flex their muscles and would demand change, which might not be great, depending on the severity of the issues. Proposals to address this, again, modernize the regulatory approach. We should not be analyzing the weather data we've got now using technology and using methods developed 50 years ago. You all know that you can do a lot more data crunching on your phone than we could do 50 years ago. And yet we're willing to have regulators say, look, here's how we do flood mapping. It's based on 50 years ago. There's better ways to do it. The best thing is that we can adopt probabilistic flood mapping. So you're not in or out. You have a better understanding of your flood probability goes from 0% if you're on top of the hill to 100% if you're at the river. And there's variation in there. You're never just completely in or completely out of flood. That requires more computing power, but we've got it. Emergency action mapping or planning needs to be coupled with flood mapping. It's not enough to know where the flood is. Do we have a response? And typically, the emergency response is under state, local, federal government. So is there a plan, and has that been communicated publicly so that we don't experience a loss of confidence? We've really got to we've got to communicate if we're doing new things. And finally, we've got to stop compromising on allowance for living and building in just flat-out known flood areas. We incentivize people to get out. There's lots of ways, I won't go into all that, but the general idea of continuing to privatize gain and socialize loss is not great. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my perspective from a career of flood modeling and mapping and technology. I believe that the most important thing is that change, how we do it, it's not optional, right? That the denial phase, I hope, is over. And now and we can blame whoever we want, but it's really not optional to change our approach, right? If we cannot change the climate for the better, we've got to change ourselves and our response. And Stephen Hawking says the intelligence, which we all purport to be intelligent beings, is our ability to adapt to change. So maybe it's just admitting that we need to change and getting on with it.